Hi again, everybody. Michael Tomasky here. I'm the editor of the New Republic. Welcome to the new issue edition of Tomaskycast, presentation of New Republic video. I'm very excited to be joined today by the Honorable John Tefft. He's the former ambassador of the United States to Russia, and for that matter, to Ukraine before that. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm glad to be with you today.
That's really nice of you to join me. So let's just start with your experience. So President Obama sent you to Kyiv in 2009, I believe it was, and then up to Moscow in 2014. So just tell people what you learned about both places in your years over there.
Well, I had already spent a lot of time working on Eastern Europe. I'd been on the Soviet desk at the State Department as early as 1983. I was the deputy director when it ceased to be the Soviet desk in 1991. I had served as the deputy chief of mission in Moscow in the late 90s, and then was ambassador in Lithuania as well as in Georgia. And that's all before I got to Ukraine in 2009. I went there at a time when many people in Washington expected a tough time ahead because you'll remember President Yushchenko and Prime Minister Timoshenko had been fighting, and a lot of people in Ukraine were frustrated with their inability to push forward the reform agenda that they had outlined during the Orange Revolution. Mm-hmm. And so an expectation that they would likely be defeated in an election, which is exactly what happened in 2010 when Viktor Yanukovych won. And Yanukovych, as we all know, was very much I won't say pro-Russia, but obviously he's from the eastern part of Ukraine and had been deeply enmeshed with the Russian interests for a long time. Sure. We all know what happened in 2014 with the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, and he fled the country, which then led Putin to invade Crimea and launch the subversion in the Donbass. So I arrived right before that election, was there in Ukraine for most of the time when Yanukovych was in power. I left in 2013 before the process of the Maidan revolution took place. But, we knew something was going to happen. We didn't know that Yanukovych was going to renounce the plans to become an associate member of the EU, which many of the Ukrainians felt was their future. They wanted a European future. They wanted a better government, less corruption inside, and they thought EU associate membership would help achieve that. This is what led, in many ways, to the launching of the protests in November of 2013. I was out of government after I retired, and had started working at the Rand Corporation when I got a phone call asking me if I would be interested in returning to government service to follow Mike McFaul as the U.S. ambassador. I got out there in 2014 after the Russian invasion, and our relationship had already plummeted. We had imposed sanctions. Anyway, it was a difficult time in Moscow in those times, but nothing as difficult as it is right now.
Well, I can imagine. So obviously you met Putin face-to-face at some point?
Yeah, I presented my credentials to him. He didn't meet with ambassadors as a rule, and certainly at this time it was a very difficult relationship with the U.S. I did see him, however, 3 times with John Kerry, actually 4 times with John Kerry, when he came and visited Putin, once in Sochi, 3 times in Moscow, and then 1 time with Rex Tillerson, the secretary under Donald Trump. Right. I sat across the table. I took notes and was able to observe Putin kind of at first hand for an extended period during that time. I was struck by a man who was very much in command of his brief, but it became pretty clear to me pretty soon that he had a pretty chip on his shoulder toward the United States. And you could see this in some of the comments he would make. You would see this in his demeanor and his teasing. I don't think he ever really got over the period of the Soviet demise, when not only did his career suffer, but he saw his whole country really transformed before his eyes, as he said many times.
Sure, sure. Do you remember any particular things he said that struck you in any of those meetings?
No, he would tease sometimes about the situation that existed. When John Kerry came, most of the discussion was about Ukraine and also about the situation in Syria. You'll remember at the end of the Obama administration, John Kerry was working extremely hard to try to get the killing stopped in Syria. And I think in the end, Putin knew that the United States was not going to act militarily. We had a very limited objective. You'll remember in Syria, we were trying to get rid of ISIS, but we were not going to get involved in another war. Then President Obama had made the judgment that it was time to get the United States out of Middle Eastern wars, and so Putin actually, I think, increased his own profile there. He was careful. I think he was calculating in a way. I think that's one of the things I would contrast to the present day. And I'm out of government now, so I don't have access to intelligence or other information. But Putin seems to have abandoned this kind of calculated risk-taking, which was his trademark, I think, in his earlier years, to take this really horrible step to go all in. As I said, I think surprised many of his own officials as well as the people in Moscow, and in effect taking a huge risk here, which I think was based on a pretty clear misunderstanding of the situation in Ukraine, as well as his own military capabilities and political support at home.
Well, this is one thing I wanted to ask, so I can segue right into it. We know that this has been Putin's view for a number of years about Ukraine and new Russia and the near abroad, and that has been his ambition with respect to Ukraine. Would you say that view was widely shared among the Russian elite? I mean, it probably was to some extent because it was Putin's view and Putin was the boss. But in your experience, were there people who said, "Gee, I don't know, this is not what we need to be doing"?
No, it wasn't that way at all. Arrived in Moscow in September of 2014. And so we had 6 months pretty much already of Russian occupation and annexation of Crimea. Yeah. We've also seen this horrible conflict in the Donbass, in the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, really take off, and thousands of people were getting killed. It was just horrific. In a way, it presaged the current situation where you see all kinds of civilian people, women and kids getting killed in shelling, indiscriminate kinds of shelling. When I got to Moscow, I made my introductory calls, and I recalled for some of my Russian friends, some of these were informal, and I said to them, I was in Donetsk and Lugansk in 2013, and I even made a trip to Odessa and over to Mykolaiv and Kherson, which we've seen in the news lately. And I said, these people didn't want to be a part of Russia. I went in Donetsk, I spoke at 3 different universities, and the kids who were there, they wanted to be a part of the Western world, very much similar to the young people who live in the rest of Ukraine. What I found in Moscow was that many Russians, both official and otherwise, had this very bad understanding of what the reality was. They somehow correlated speaking the Russian language with sympathy toward Russia and not native Ukraine. And as we've seen during this tragic war now, you go to places like Kharkiv, where the vast majority of people speak Russian as a first language. And what they've done is increasingly been some of the greatest resistance to the Russians. There's a fundamental set of misunderstandings here that I think Putin and many people in Russia, especially the small group of people around Putin who are his closest advisors on this war and on Ukraine itself.
So, did this surprise you? The full-scale invasion?
No, I stay in touch with people in the country to the extent I can. A lot of that's broken off now because of the laws that have been passed and other things, and some of the internet is down. But it really didn't kind of surprise me. There were a lot of American friends of mine who who thought Putin really was all in, who saw a change in the man himself, and who, in some of his statements and in some of the plans, a determination to do something completely. I've been on a web conference I think a week before the war, and there were several of America's most prominent Russian military analysts or American analysts of Russian military behavior. And they had all different, they had assessments, and they coalesced around an attempt, which is what we've actually seen, a three-pronged south, east, and north with an attempt to try to get into Kyiv, to bring down the government quickly and to take over. As we've seen, it's been a faulty set of assumptions. They're adjusting to it now, but many of the American experts understood this better than the people in Russia did, I think, or the people around Putin did.
Right, right. Yeah, a lot of people are saying that because Russians aren't getting real information. I mean, that's a real thing, right?
Yeah, it's. I think the internet is still open, but clearly the government, with these draconian laws and shutting down free, in effect, shutting down the last vestiges of free media in the country, is preventing people from getting the information. But, you know, I've been struck. I was watching the other day a piece on Radio Free Europe's website, and it was basically a email of a tape of two women taking on the governor of Kemerovo Oblast. Kemerovo is out in Siberia. And the governor was talking to them about the situation, and they got up and said, "Why are we sending our boys to be cannon fodder in Ukraine?" And he tried to push them off and try not to answer the questions, and they kept pressing. This is a point I think Tom Friedman has made in a number of his articles, that the access to the internet, the ability of people to take pictures, you know, I mean, we see this every day when we watch these horrible stories about the war in Ukraine. Everybody's now a reporter. Everybody, if he has access to the internet, can take photos with his phone and put it up there. And I'm not sure that the Russians, this is another area where I'm not sure the Russians really have calculated how it affects their interests. It's a new part of not just information warfare, but the role of information during fighting a war.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So we're talking on Wednesday morning, March 9, mid-morning. Want to just give folks your assessment of where you think things stand right now?
Well, I think I'm amazed but not surprised at the resistance that the Ukrainians have mounted. It really is heroic. It's absolutely fascinating to watch Vladimir Zelensky make his statements. I watched him in his presentation yesterday to the British Parliament, where he was quoting Churchill about continuing to fight. But he's clearly led the country, and you can just see in the statements people are making, the horrors that they've experienced, the women and children escaping, but leaving their husbands and their brothers and sons in Ukraine to fight the war, and still supporting that war. That part didn't surprise me, because I think the Ukrainians have had a really strong and growing sense over the last 30 years of what I call kind of civic national consciousness. I'm always afraid to use the word nationalism because that has so many negative connotations. But what you've had, and the fundamental mistake that Putin has made, is to somehow press his own ideological approach that somehow Ukraine is part of Russia, that these are one country. I mean, it hasn't been true for a long, long time, and it certainly isn't true today.
He really thought that most Ukrainians thought the way he thought?
Yeah, I think they made this set of assumptions, and as I said, I realized this really personally when I went to Moscow in September of 2014, and I saw it throughout my time there. Now, part of this is the propaganda operation that they have going on television, where people see night after night this very heavy-handed, even when I was there, it was very heavy-handed propaganda. NATO was the enemy. Ukraine was the enemy. United States was the biggest of enemies. And they drummed this in. And there's a lot of people who believe it. You can see in some of the reporting that's coming out of Russia that there's a lot of people who participate in this. But at the same time, especially the younger generations, Michael, they have long since stopped watching television. And they get their information from the internet. And you can see that this is getting through. I gave this Kemerovo example as just one. The word gets out. There's no way in a global information society that you can repress all of this information, despite obviously the heavy-handed efforts that the government is trying to make right now. So, I think this will still be out there. And for me, one of the most fascinating things to watch, and the CIA director Bill Burns mentioned this yesterday, how they're watching very closely the reactions of people in Russia, not just to sanctions and the economic problems that are befalling Russia, but also to other factors. And I think one of the big ones, is going to be when they start having to bury the bodies of these soldiers, the apparently thousands who have died in Ukraine. They're going to have to explain to people why it is that these guys died fighting people who they've been constantly told were their brothers and sisters, their Slavic brothers and sisters. Right. There's going to be a collision here, a disconnect, I think, in the minds of even ordinary Russians who would support what Putin generally would try to do. And I think it's still going to take a while before we see that, but I think it's going to come.
Do you see a really long, drawn-out conflict now, a long occupation? And do you see Russia eventually prevailing because of its, far greater manpower, or do you see maybe Ukraine?
It's so hard to answer your question. The fact that the Ukrainians are doing as well as they are, obviously lots of military equipment is going in, and the supply lines are there. I think that's obviously one factor, and the spirit in Ukraine, from everything we can tell, is just it's just amazing. The willingness of people to fight and die for Ukraine. And then on the other side, you have not only all of the economic and other sanctions that the United States and Europe, really the world, have put on Russia, but you also have what appears to be a badly organized, a badly supplied, low morale military force on the Russian side. Yeah. Put all these factors together, it's hard to kind of calculate how long this will go. I think as Bill Burns and Avril Haines said yesterday in their testimony to the Congress, Putin is likely to double down, and he's going to pursue this really horrible, indiscriminate killing of civilians to try to change the view of the people of Ukraine. But the opposite seems to be happening. The more violent it gets, the more arbitrary and indiscriminate it is, the more people are resolved to fight and throw off the Russian invaders. A lot, I think, depends, and I'm not a military man, a lot depends on whether they are able to surround and cut off Kyiv. So far, they haven't been able to do that. Right. And, different military analysts will have different views about that.
So here's the big question, at least from the perspective of the United States of America, which is, I heard it argued this morning two different ways on television, and read articles that argue it two different ways. On the one hand, Putin wants NATO and the United States to be drawn into this because he's just that detached from reality, or because, if he's losing this war, he wants to shift emphasis and create chaos in the world. On the other hand, the argument is that the last thing in the world he wants is confrontation with NATO and directly with the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
I've always thought that Putin did not want a conflict with NATO because he knows what the balance is when it comes to not just nuclear, but also conventional forces. NATO has a far higher predominance. And one would think that given the performance of his military in this campaign, that he would have less confidence of his conventional forces than he perhaps had going into the war. Right. I don't see that Putin has a real desire to fight against the West. The fear that's out there, and it was mentioned in Tom Friedman's article in the New York Times yesterday, is that back to the wall, failing to be able to achieve his objectives, he might lash out and do something crazy, and that's always possible. But I still think he's a calculating guy. CIA Director Burns said yesterday, he pushed back against questions that the members of the Congress had for him about whether Putin was irrational or crazy. Now he's still rational. The problem is Putin is a street fighter from his growing up in Leningrad and his experience in the KGB, and he doesn't like to lose. And he's gone all in on this one, which is what leads people to say he will not only double down and keep at this, no matter what it takes, but who fear that he could do something truly irrational at the end. And, I certainly hope that isn't the case. I don't have any special insights into this. It would be contrary to his usual behavior, but he's watching the situation in his own country get worse, and he's seeing all of the things that he assumed he would achieve being reversed. The unity of NATO, Germany changing its policies, China now is giving assistance, humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, still supporting Russia, but obviously kind of hedging their bets a little bit. This doesn't look good in many ways for Putin.
So last question here. If he is rational and sees all these things and this drags on and he sees that he's not going to win the way he thought he was going to win, what are a set of points on which Putin and Ukraine and the West can potentially agree to end this?
This is another really tough one. I think as I look at the efforts that they are making militarily, the Russians, clearly they're trying to control as much of what he would consider the Russian-speaking areas. I mean, you can see they failed to take Kharkiv, although they've destroyed most of the city, from what I can tell. This is in many ways the greatest of insults to Putin's ideas, because Kharkiv, was one of the great, even going back into the Russian Empire, a great industrial as well as educational center. And these people have resisted fiercely what his effort to annex them. So if you look at maps and you see the efforts that are being made around the edge, the cities like Kharkiv, of Chernihiv, which is one of the old, it goes back as far as Kiev itself. And then down around in the south, they have not attacked Odessa, but there's fears to do that. But trying to control as much of that Black Sea, to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. Now, I think the Ukrainians won't agree to a lot of that. Having fought and died, and so many have died fighting for this, I think some kind of a territorial adjustment there is going to be extremely hard to negotiate. I suspect what you'd get is a ceasefire, and then, as we've seen in other places, I saw it in Georgia when I was ambassador there, they just don't ever move beyond the ceasefire. They don't honor the ceasefire, but they don't resume action. But still pretty wildly speculative, Michael. It's there's, I think, probably weeks, sadly, of fighting that's going to continue, and it's hard to see how these sides are so divided. It's hard to see how they could reach some kind of a quick territorial compromise, even if the Ukrainians were in it. And I'm not sure that they would even agree to it at this point.
Yeah. And with respect to Ukraine's future and possible membership in EU and NATO?
Well, I think Zelensky has made comments about, we're not going to be in NATO anytime soon. Is there relation there that could be put together? I mean, it's hard to say. I doubt that the Ukrainians would ever agree to some of these, proposals that we've seen floated, that Ukraine would forever and put it in their constitution that they would never be a member of NATO. I don't see that happening.
Right.
I don't see the government agreeing into it, and I don't see that the people of Ukraine, after all they've been through, would agree to something like that.
Fascinating stuff. Ambassador John Tefft, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael.
Appreciate it.